In 1918, famed occultist Aleister Crowley visited the French Quarter in New Orleans. Draping himself over a stool in a watering hole where Bienville meets Bourbon Street, Crowley ordered a glass of illegal absinthe, outlawed in the United States since 1912, a forbidden drink with its origins in medieval alchemy, more of a potion than a beverage, historically associated with magic and witchcraft. Crowley drained his glass, then ordered another and another. Pleasantly toasted and creatively inspired, he uncapped his pen and wrote a seminal essay about life, death, vice, and what it means to be an artist. He called it Absinthe, the Green Goddess, and it began like this.
Keep always this dim corner for me, that I may sit while the green hour glides, a proud pavane of time. For I am no longer in the city accursed, where time is horsed on the white gelding death, his spurs rusted with blood. There is a corner of the United States which he has overlooked. It lies in New Orleans, between Canal Street and Esplanade Avenue, the Mississippi for its base. Thence it reaches northward to a most curious desert land, where is a cemetery lovely beyond dreams, its walls low and whitewashed, within which straggles a wilderness of strange and fantastic tombs. And hard by is that great city of brothels which is so cynically mirthful a neighbour. At least the poet of La Légende des Sexes was right, and the psychoanalyst after him, in identifying the mother with the tomb. This then is only the beginning and end of things, this quartier macabre beyond the northern rampart, and the Mississippi on the other side is like the space between. Our life which flows and fertilises as it flows, muddy and malarious as it may be, to empty itself into the warm bosom of the Gulf Stream, which in our allegory we may call the life of God.
Hi, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge of the channel Esoterica. By 1918, Aleister Crowley had accomplished more than a lifetime's worth of achievements. He had escaped the gravitation of his fundamentalist Christian upbringing. He had established himself as a careful poet. He had forged his skills as an expert mountaineer. And most of all, he pioneered a path in religious occultism. In the world of esotericism, Crowley delved into the spiritual athleticism of the Abramelin ritual, first in the Highlands of Scotland, and then completed the grueling ritual crossing the wastes of China. He practiced yoga in India. He developed sex magic in Paris and North Africa. He performed the headless ritual in the bowels of the Great Pyramid and received a new scripture, the Book of the Law, in Cairo, founding the new religion of Thelema. He combated and summoned demons the world over, spending his sizable inherited fortune along the way. When Crowley arrived in New York City in 1914, he was broke. Relying on members of the occult OTO order and his sizable skills as a writer, he nevertheless toured the United States from coast to coast before arriving here in New Orleans, his favorite city in the US. He was in his 40s by then, and despite the financial hardships, the great beast Aleister Crowley was already a literary and occult maestro. Like many artists before and since, Crowley immediately felt at home in the French Quarter, and as he stared into his glass of absinthe, he mused about the magic of the creative process, speaking of it in monumental, even biblical terms.
Originally, in the fantastic but significant legend of the Hebrews, the rainbow is mentioned as a sign of salvation. The world had been purified by water and was ready for the revelation of wine. God would never again destroy his work, but ultimately seal its perfection by a baptism of fire. Can it be that in the opalescence of absinthe is some occult link with this mystery of the rainbow? For undoubtedly, one glass does indefinably and subtly insulate the drinker within the secret chamber of beauty, does kindle his thoughts to rapture, adjust his point of view to that of the artist, at least in that degree of which he is originally capable, weave for his fancy a gala dress of stuff as many-coloured as the mind of Aphrodite.
At the time of Crowley's visit, the city was at the tail end of one of the most dynamic periods in its history. Though it was the jewel of the Mississippi during antebellum days, the Civil War and its consequences had sent the Crescent City into a period of social upheaval and a steep economic decline. Following the failure of Reconstruction, upper-class white Southern Democrats regained control of local government and instituted a system of racial apartheid which marginalized both the city's black freedmen and its community of mixed-race Creoles, who suddenly found themselves thrust out of the social orbit of the white elite. Times were hard here in the late 19th century, especially for poor black communities. I know it's hard to imagine now, but if you can believe it, public health, sanitation, and infrastructure in New Orleans was actually very bad at the time. In 1878, a yellow fever epidemic wiped out 2% of the population. In 1880, the life expectancy for black New Orleanians was only 36. For whites, it was 46. The rates of black infant mortality were even more sobering. On average, only 1 of 2 black newborns would survive infancy. In these horrific conditions, New Orleanians turned to vice to distract them from their sorrows: drinking, dancing, sex work, and especially music. It was at this time that neighborhood brass bands, mostly but not exclusively black, began to experiment with a hot, energetic new style of music with a broad array of social and artistic influences. Blacks drew from their own tradition of West African drumming and gospel music. Mixed-race Creoles offered melodic contributions from their quadrilles, waltzes, and marches, while whites brought highbrow classical music and opera to the cultural table. By the turn of the 20th century, a brand new, uniquely New Orleanian genre of music was being played all over the city, most vibrantly in black quarters. The genre wasn't codified or formalized at that point and remained largely experimental. It didn't even have a name yet. But the invention of this peculiar, provincial style of music, played by the poor and downtrodden in a backwater southern city, would prove to be the most groundbreaking artistic revolution in American history. It was the birth of jazz, and in a matter of decades, its influence would spread all across the planet and lay the foundation for modern music. In this same period, 1897 to be exact, a city official seeking to curb New Orleans' proliferation of illegal sex work drafted an ordinance confining the world's oldest profession to a designated area of 20 square blocks, located lakeside of the French Quarter, tastefully hidden behind a massive railway depot on Basin Street. The ordinance backfired spectacularly. Pimps and madams flocked to the new district, soon christened Storyville, following the scent of money. Within a few years, what had been a quiet working-class neighborhood was completely transformed into the most lavish red-light district in the country. The district's famous mansions facing the rail depot catered to wealthy tourists, while dank one-room shacks known as cribs served less moneyed clientele. Sex work was contained, yes, but within those 20 blocks it thrived like never before. Of all the bohemias in New Orleans history, and there have been many, none matched the extravagance and notoriety of Storyville. Debauchery of every kind abounded, as did a great deal of racial and sexual abuse. Thanks to Jim Crow, Storyville brothels were whites-only establishments, so a parallel black red-light district sprang up upriver on the other side of Canal Street. Jazz wasn't an international sensation yet, and the legendary pioneers of the genre were still starving artists at this stage. Many of them would hone their craft playing for pennies at these black brothels. In the first decade of the 20th century, cornetist Buddy Bolden would make musical history, as well as indulge his crippling alcohol addiction, at a church-cum-music venue nicknamed Funky Butt Hall on Perdido Street, just a few doors down from the childhood home of Louis Armstrong. Though jazz was at first considered too low class for the elegant bordellos of Storyville, celebrated black musicians like Jelly Roll Morton and Tony Jackson were commonly employed there playing more highbrow tunes, unlikely to offend white tourists. Then, in 1917, the year before Aleister Crowley's visit, 2 major events would bring this epoch of New Orleans history to an end. First, a group called the Original Dixieland Jazz Band brought New Orleans jazz to New York City, generating a national fan base and, most crucially, recording an album, which propelled the genre out of obscurity and into the stratosphere. And second, with the American entry into World War I, and due to the United States Navy's concern for the virtue of its sailors, Storyville was shuttered by federal decree. As Crowley sat in the back of the old Absinthe house in 1918, getting wasted and scribbling on a piece of paper, he was surrounded by the afterglow of a legendary American bohemia, where genius and vice swirled together as surely as wormwood and sugar. I like to think it was the great duality of this beautiful, wretched city that inspired Crowley to write,
"The genius feels himself slipping constantly heavenward. The gravitation of eternity draws him. He is like a ship torn by the tempest from the harbour, where the master must needs take on new passengers to the happy isles. So he must throw out anchors, and the only holding is the mire. Thus, in order to maintain the equilibrium of sanity, the artist is obliged to seek fellowship with the grossest of mankind."
Absinthe conjures for us a lost world. The time of the French Belle Epoque with its countless cafes, its bohemian artists and poets, the early days of electric light, the 1889 World's Fair, just as the Eiffel Tower went up. It was a world before world wars and atomic weapons. It's a world near to us and yet separated by an unimaginable gulf. And that lost world of the arcades and the flaneurs was fueled by absinthe. Absinthe is a distilled spirit made by the maceration of the so-called Holy Trinity of green anise, sweet fennel, and the spirit's namesake, grand wormwood, or Artemisia absinthium. This bitter, medicinal maceration is then distilled into a spirit typically between 68 and 72% alcohol, in which is steeped a further herbal infusion of Roman wormwood, or Artemisia pontica, hyssop, and lemon balm, thus giving absinthe its distinct floral character and peridot green color. With its beginnings as a medicinal tonic, absinthe was first commercially produced in cuvée beginning in 1797. The famed Pernod distillery would be established at Pontarlier in 1805. That city, the capital of absinthe, would eventually boast some 25 absinthe distilleries. And after being provided as a medicinal ration to soldiers, absinthe would positively rocket into popularity through the 19th century. By 1910, just 5 years before the ban, France was consuming 36 million liters of absinthe annually. Absinthe quickly became the national drink of France, but the end was near. Anti-absinthe sentiment arose just as quickly as did its popularity. Cheap, adulterated absinthe containing poisons like copper sulfate and antimony chloride, which falsely colored and created the louche effect, entered the market, which was, at that time, basically unregulated. To what degree these poisonous concoctions added to the legend of absinthe's deleterious effects isn't entirely clear, though the reputation of the profligate absintteur was well on its way, as Crowley indeed noted.
What is it in absinthe that makes it a separate cult? The effects of its abuse are totally distinct from those of other stimulants. Even in ruin and in degradation, it remains a thing apart. Its victims wear a ghastly aureole all of their own, and in their peculiar hell yet gloat with a sinister perversion of pride that they are not as other men.
However, an unholy alliance of the French temperance movement and the vintners would spell the doom for absinthe. Just as it was enjoying meteoric success, the French grape stock was being positively devastated by the insect phylloxera. Wine production and in turn distilled brandies like cognac were decimated. And it was toward the end of the 19th century that a solution was actually discovered in, of all things, American rootstock, resistant to the pest. Once back on their feet, the vintners had to defeat absinthe for its market share, and thus, allied with the temperance movement, ironically enough, began the anti-absinthe propaganda campaign. Absinthe caused degeneration, madness, destroyed families, caused hallucinations, murder, and finally suicide. Absinthe became poverty, madness, and death in a bottle, and with the growing frenzy of the temperance movement and war on the horizon, France banned absinthe in 1915. America's relationship to absinthe was just as fraught in some ways. Seeing what officials at that time called the Green Menace from afar, the Americans sought to curtail the allure of absinthe before it could even take root in this country. Indeed, it was growing so popular in the early 20th century that one large French producer was told by US Customs that if any more of their absinthe entered the country, the distillery would have to open their own embassy. So in a preemptive strike, the Americans banned absinthe in 1912, 3 years before the French did. Of course, with New Orleans being the center of Francophile culture in America, the absinthe continued to be poured and continued to be louched. Smuggled in from Spain and Cuba, a tradition actually carried on by Hemingway some years later, as he would, in his own words, get tight on absinthe and do knife tricks. Despite the ban 6 years prior, in 1918, Crowley and the other denizens of New Orleans could still enjoy the spirit at the old Absinthe House. In fact, the glasses of the spirit are the first Crowley ever consumed, despite his years in Paris. Well versed in drugs and drink, we can perhaps trust his account of the effects of the milky green spirit.
And it is no doubt that in the due employment of this liquor, such effects are easy to obtain. A single glass seems to render the breathing freer, the spirit lighter, the heart more ardent, soul and mind alike more capable of executing the great task of doing that particular work in the world which the Father may have sent them to perform. Food itself loses its gross qualities in the presence of absinthe, and becomes even as manna, operating the sacrament of nutrition without bodily disturbance.
The epicenter of this scofflawery stood and stands at the corner of Bourbon and Bienville in the French Quarter. Built originally as a grocery in the early 19th century and converted to a bar in the 1830s, it had become associated with absinthe by the 1870s, earning the name the Absinthe House, eventually the Old Absinthe House. Even the decor testifies to the centrality of absinthe, the bar sporting beautiful marble absinthe fountains, the bases eroded from decades of water flowing into the spirit. Crowley even notes them. "Keep always this dim corner for me, that I may sit while the green hour glides, a proud praveen of time. Here too are marble basins hollowed and hallowed by the dripping of the waters, which creates by baptism the new spirit of absinthe." Thus, the old Absinthe House, beset with all manner of legends, became a kind of renegade holdout for a world that was quickly slipping into the oblivion of war and prohibition. And even in Crowley's day, it held fast as a kind of spiritual capital of that ghostly world. Though by 1918, the ban on absinthe must have just seemed like an opening salvo of what was to come. Introduced into the 66th Congress of the United States of America on June 27, 1919 by Minnesota Republican Andrew Volstead, national prohibition would become law on October 28, 1919, with enforcement beginning at 1 second past midnight on January 17, 1920. Of course, the temperance movement had long proven popular given the bender the country had been on, and when Crowley sipped his already illegal absinthe, New Orleans had long been staring down the barrel of prohibition, an especially cruel fate for the Crescent City. Of course, Crowley, the expert tippler himself, had not a little invective for this moral crusade against liquor.
The prohibitionist must always be a person of no moral character, for he cannot even conceive of the possibility of a man capable of resisting temptation. Still more, he is so obsessed, like the savage, by the fear of the unknown, that he regards alcohol as a fetish, necessarily alluring and tyrannical. With this ignorance of human nature goes an even grosser ignorance of the divine nature. He does not understand that the universe has only one possible purpose, that, the business of life being happily completed by the production of the necessities and luxuries incidental to comfort, the residuum of human energy needs an outlet. The surplus of will must find issue in the elevation of the individual towards the Godhead, and the method of such elevation is by religion, love, and art. Now these three things are indissolubly bound up with wine, for they are themselves species of intoxication.
One of the most fascinating parts of Crowley's essay is when he sketches a kind of prose portrait about the various people he meets in the old Absinthe House. There's a bit of a leering quality to Crowley's observations here, and his haughty judgments are anything but objective. However, these quick lines are a tantalizing glimpse into the lives of the people of the French Quarter more than 100 years ago. Just like today, many of them are, and I say this with great affection, hot messes. The first person Crowley tells us about is a young woman of about 30, though she's aged beyond her years. She's sitting at the table nearest to Crowley, drinking beer and gin. Years ago, she married a wealthy cotton broker, she tells him, and enjoyed a lavish lifestyle in Europe. But the marriage fell apart. Chasing respectability, she married again, presumably to a New Orleanian, who was less successful but unimpeachable. She has a dripping disdain for what she calls those girls, and insists that she never runs around with men. But the woman's actions in the old Absinthe House stand in stark contrast with the contentment she professes with the trajectory of her life. As Crowley speaks with her, she gets, quote, solidly drunk, and our author perceives a deep melancholy about her. Since, as Crowley observes, she failed to realize that respectability is a lie, and that love, not the sanction of church or state, makes marriage sacred, this poor woman seeks asylum in her absinthe glass. Crowley didn't regard absinthe as an asylum or an escape. Happily drunk over his new favorite potion, he declared that the consumption of absinthe was nothing less than a crusade. With fittingly medieval imagery, he writes,
"Wine is the ripe gladness which accompanies valour and rewards toil. It is the plume on a man's lance head, a fluttering gallantry, not good to lean upon."
The bar begins to fill up, as Crowley scribbles, and the sleepy afternoon gradually comes alive with the whirl and rush of humanity. Crowley continues to observe, and he eavesdrops on various conversations. He feels detached from the merriment, but he makes sure to take the time to hit on his waiter, a young mixed-race man he describes as a sleek and lithe Black Panther. sounding an awful lot like the middle-aged gay men who go drink on St. Anne Street today, too old and too drunk to realize that they're being problematic. But what else could we expect from bisexual icon Aleister Crowley? Soon, Crowley latches onto another patron, an old Frenchman, a veteran with a gleaming Legion of Honor medal pinned to his shabby overcoat. In his youth, probably the 1850s, he helped dig the first artesian wells in the Sahara Desert. Now he flits between his little apartment on Bourbon Street and the old Absinthe house, drinking away his autumn years, living off of his military pension, and waiting for death to come take him. At some point, as the evening wears on, Crowley realizes that he's been so engrossed in his writing he failed to realize that his girlfriend had entered the bar and sat right down next to him. He decides to go with her away from the old Absinthe house and continue their jaunt through the quarter. Perhaps, he writes, they'll go to the river and listen to mariners tell tall tales. No doubt the stories will be lies, he tells us, but no less delightful in the telling. The more things change, the more they stay the same. There's a tangible spirit in this old square, and it seems little dulled with age. I feel it every time I cross Rampart Street. It's enough to almost make you believe in ghosts. New Orleans is undergoing tremendous change at the moment, and this neighborhood is not immune to that. But there's also been a spiritual through line here, so constant and unyielding, it's almost spooky. I'd like to propose a toast, if I may, to the French Quarter, the last, best, and truest American Bohemia.
Aleister Crowley's 1918 essay captures something powerful and timeless, the magic of a place and time that endures both storms and tourists. Some of the soul of New Orleans captured in the spiritual heart of the French Quarter. Tennessee Williams once quipped, "America has only 3 cities, New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans. Everywhere else is Cleveland." It's really this spirit of the city, really a kind of magic that sets New Orleans apart, that Crowley captures powerfully. And to be sure, it's a dark, seductive, and vice-laden magic, but surely vices are to be carefully cultivated, as Crowley knew better than most. And who better to capture that spirit, that magic, somehow paradoxically between both saint and sin, than the great beast 666, by tippling the Green Fairy at the old Absinthe house.
If you're wondering where we got all this sick absinthe equipment, it was from Maison Absinthe in Baton Rouge, a great little company where you can get all of this awesome stuff on their online store, and the link is in the description. So thanks, guys, for bringing this down. And thanks to Justin's buddy John for driving all the way from Baton Rouge. I'm like Ignatius Riley. I don't go to Baton Rouge. Just not someplace you'll find me. But if Maison Absinthe had a storefront, then I would make an exception. Cheers.